We're so excited to have you here, Bob Dotson. Thank you so much for, volunteering your time. So for those of you who don't know Bob, he was a longtime correspondent for NBC News and the Today Show. Your segment, Bob, was The American Story with Bob Dotson. Several books, American Story, A Lifetime Search for Ordinary People Doing Extraordinary Things, and my personal favorite, Make It Memorable. When I wanted to become a reporter, one of my good friends said, you have to read this. She said, it's my Bible. And it's my Bible too. So thank you for being here, Bob. We will play some videos throughout, but I'm going to start with some questions. Actually, what I want to start with first, I was perusing some of your scripts. So in his book, Bob includes scripts from some of his greatest stories. And just listen to this writing. They were small town kids with barefoot voices. These are kids who could make the faces on Mount Rushmore grin. The smoke had not yet drifted away from the Japanese sneak attack at Pearl Harbor before the arrests began. Herded onto a spit of sand. These are just little snippets from different pieces. It is harder to be brave the day after reason returns and reveals the odds. I mean, I shiver when I hear these words because I don't think I could ever write as well as you do. So I think my first question, and I have many, is how to be a good storyteller under the insane deadlines that we're all under now with the advent of social media.
Well, the key is to become more efficient as a storyteller. And here's a little insight. Most great stories are not found. They're built. And so think of storytelling kind of like architecture. You've got a certain number of building blocks. You got some natural sound, you got a piece of information, you've got a quote. And so the question becomes, within the time that you have to do it, what comes first, what comes second, and what pays off the story? So even if it's a very short tweet or something that you're doing with only a few minutes to get it done, if you become efficient, and that's what we're going to talk about, some tips on how to do that. Like, for instance, we've all heard about who, what, when, where, and why, kind of the mantra of being a journalist. But I have a different mantra to be efficient. I do it like this. Hey, you got to get their attention right at the start. So when you start looking at the building blocks, you say, okay, what is the most piece of information or visual or sound that will do that? Hey, you get their attention right at the start. That seems to be obvious, but some people don't. They wander around and they bury the lead. We know that. So it's hey. The next one is you. This story may be about a train derailment in Topeka, but this is why you care about it in Long Island. So all news is local, right? So you want to get to the point where you say, no matter what I'm telling you, you really want to know about this. So you hook it to the viewer right away. Hey, you get their attention. You, this is about you. The third thing is see. So you probably had this information on your phone, on the backs of cabs, delivered to your front door. And so why don't I going to regurgitate it the same way and with the same material? Because you already know it. So because you're the storyteller, they want to come to you because you connect the seemingly unconnected. Kind of like some of those quotes you just gave me back. It kind of reminds me of when I was young. but so it's hey, get their attention. You, this is about you. And see, this is how I connect the seemingly unconnected. I think the definition of a storyteller is someone who could tell you and show you something that you might miss even standing next to them. Oh, so it's hey, hey, you see. And the last one is so. So why should you care? Every story, even if it's 38 seconds, needs to be why did you spend time with me? So then they'll come back again.
So Bob, what are your thoughts on, I've had some bosses say, always lead your story. If you have an emotional soundbite, always lead with that. But I've had other people think, no, I don't think you should ever lead with the soundbite. I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Well, a really great joke has to have a setup. And so you never lead with an emotional soundbite because it catches people off guard. They have no context of what's going on. Let me give you a little quick story. I was following a guy around in a grade 3 tornado, like 3 days later, nothing going on. Everybody was there to go talk to the governor who's going to say, I'm going to ask for some federal assistance. And then there would be a gaggle of reporters chasing after the governor. Well, I followed this guy who had bib overalls because I figured that he might, actually have something that could relate to the people who were watching. Well, he was looking for something, but I never asked him what he was looking for because I didn't want it. I wanted to be as excited about it as he was when he found it. But that's my point. If he was so gregarious, he would turn to the camera and he would give a bunch of great quotes. And so the photojournalist I was working with said, you know, you don't want to go right to the punchline, and you'll hear it in a second, because they don't know him well enough yet. Take a couple of beats and let his personality come out or some information come out that sets up the punchline. And this is the punchline. He finally found what he was looking for, and he was so comfortable with us and the camera. So we had a wireless mic on him, you know, so he'd been talking to us, that he pulled down, went down in a big pile, he came up with a big hunk of pink goo, stuck it right next to his mouth, looked right at the camera and said, well, that tornado got my false teeth, but it didn't get me. It did not get me. Well, hell, I could have started with it, but you don't know him yet, right? So you want to say, okay, we're here. There's a tornado that came through here 3 days ago, and here's Fred, and he's looking for something. We don't know what it is, but stick with us, no matter if I only 38 seconds. And so nobody's going to click away. They got to find out what Fred's looking for. I didn't put that in the front, and I didn't put his soundbite at the front because there's no concept to that. You know, so you need the setup. You need a little something, or you, in other words, you don't want to drain the emotion from your story.
But Bob, going off of that, then how did you grab the viewer at the beginning, like you were just talking about?
Well, he was really an interesting, fun guy. So we showed the gaggle of reporters chasing after the governor. And we said, of course, the governor is going to tell you he's going to ask for federal assistance. That's why we're here, folks. But Fred's looking for something. And then he comes up with a piece of natural sound, you know, just a little bit of a setup to introduce who he is. And he's engaging. He was the kind of guy that could fill a room, right? So since his personality was intriguing, that's what we started with.
Oh, that's a great setup. I love that. One of my biggest struggles is what to not include. And when I first became a reporter, there was a local reporter here in New York, NJ Burkett, and he came up to me and he said, that's going to be basically your biggest battle. And it's so true. And I'm wondering if you've struggled with that. You know, there's always so much information, like if you're covering a crime or anything really, right? Any good story. And I still struggle to this day with, what don't I put in? Like, is it okay to leave this out?
Well, you and I are not the only people. Mark Twain had a great line about that. He said he would write things to his friends and he'd say, I'm sorry this story is so long. I didn't have time to write a short one. You know, it's all whittling, right? But the point is, if every time I go back to my mantra, I got a hey, I got a you, I got a see, and I got a so. And so that, you know, those are the hangers in my closet. And then whatever time I have, I drape them with information or pictures or what have you. So I efficiently figure out what the story is. My idea of a story is not what the story is about, but what's the point of my story? So in the case of the one I just talked about, it'd be tornadoes took teeth. Boom. So now that's what I'm going to build to. But now I know where I'm going to get off the stage, right? That's what I'm building to. And it makes me so much more efficient in whittling down what I've got. And of course, if you have tremendous stuff, no boss is going to be sad if you say, I got a 3-part series. Great, you know, but don't try to jam it all into the same story, because not only will you get confused, but your viewer or reader will be too.
So I'm wondering are there any words or phrases, you know, the cliches that you automatically are like, don't use these in your pieces?
Well, if I hear one more reporter ask someone in a really tragic situation like a hurricane, how do you feel? Do you think anybody in the audience doesn't know exactly how they feel? You know, you could come up with an open-ended question, and that would be so much better. In other words, I studied questions for a long time. Did you notice that everybody answers, and me too, answers questions in 3 parts? They give you the answer they think you've asked for, and then they explain their answer. But if you wait just a second before jumping in for the 3rd part of that, they get a little nervous because it's silent. And they figure, well, I haven't really explained it well. And they go, well, dummy, that's why I killed my wife. Well, you were there on a dog story, and now you're got a murderer who's just giving you the answer. So it's the rule of 3s. And if you remember that, you can let them pop in with something that will get, if you're not for a soundbite, will give you a much more deep understanding of the other ways that you can tell this story.
You know what? In accordance with what you just said, a reporter once told me, always ask the person, is there anything else you'd like to add? And I would say 95% of the time, that's the soundbite you want.
Of course, yeah, because you don't know them well enough, and the subject you haven't had enough time really. And also another little trick is never be the smartest person in the room.
Oh, I like
And
that.
I watch it sometimes where you watch a reporter and they will give the answer to the person. So you really want to make sure that the horse is alive. Yes, I do. I really want to. And that's the soundbite they use instead of, doing an open-ended question about horses so that you can get some feeling and some emotion. The Shah of Iran was dying. We were all lined up out in West Texas because his son was going to an Air Force base out there. We all wanted to get a soundbite with the son. I went in to get some cheeseburgers after we never found the son. I come back and the photojournalist from NBC named Scotty Berner is surrounded by the competition. And I said, Scotty, what's going on? He said, well, I got an interview with the Shah of Iran's son and no one else got it. And I said, wait a minute, you were there with 7 other people. He said, well, they all had their cameras pointed toward this house where we thought he was, but we never saw him. And I turned around and looked down the hill. And here came this kid who looked like he didn't grow up in Lubbock, Texas. So I took my camera off the sticks. I walked down and I didn't say, hey, I'm Scotty Berner, Network Tool. How do you feel? Are you the Shah of Iran's son? All I did was I noticed that he was looking at flowers. And I said, those are beautiful flowers, aren't they? And he said, yeah. And then Scotty said, my dad loved flowers. And he stopped talking. And the kid goes, soundbite, soundbite, soundbite. And then Scott said, I still wasn't sure whether he was the Shah of Iran's son, but the bodyguards started popping up behind the hedges and they go, oh, no, no, and they came running down. He says, I'm not going to start arguing my First Amendment freedoms with people carrying Second Amendment freedoms. So I shot the other pictures I needed and went and fed the story up. So he did that by asking the question that was not a question. In other words, you look what they're interested in, you start talking about that, and you gradually bring them over to the topic that you're interested in. You set it up, you stop talking, and you let them fill the silence.
What do you think about stand-up bridges versus a stand-up close in a story?
Well, I think a lot of it just depends on whatever that happens to be in style. When we did it, it was all when I first started. It was almost all these stand-up bridges, just to show you that you were out there and with them. But now with the live shots, you're going back to the person on camera. But that brings up another point. When I start to figure out these building blocks, I said, what information can I find pictures for? But no matter how the story goes, will be so important that I must tell them. And that's what you put in your stand-up close or bridge.
So this is from your book, a direct quote, and I love this. Storytelling begins with how the news affects the viewers, not the people we cover. Can you explain that?
Well, if you cover Congress, you eventually almost start thinking like a senator or a congressperson, or if you're in City Hall, and then you get to be kind of inside. Well, remember, the people who are watching this, they really don't care about the debate at City Council if they're going to put in a new sewer system down the street. You want to go get Maud, who says, it's not going to stink by Tuesday. That's what they told us. Isn't that a much better soundbite than it would be all right, we have all the votes and we passed it and we're going to have all the new sewers in by Tuesday. I mean, you can set that up yourself and you can give a couple of instances where you show the politicians, but you go find a strong central character, kind of like the guy with the bib overalls who is looking for something in the tornado, who the audience can relate. They can relate better to people that look like them than they can topics. And most politicians deal only in topics and sound bites.
So that goes along to another portion of your book, I think, when you keep referring to the guy with the teeth, find strong central characters. And I think a lot of this advice is good for TV and also any kind of writing, newspapers, magazines. So any other strong central characters you want to talk about and how you built the story around them?
Well, I was in Mississippi one day and some folks in a coffee shop said you ought to go out and see Jim Crudup because he's been restoring an old car and we're going to have a big group here. They're going to show us you a bunch of old cars and you're a feature reporter. You ought to do old cars, right? So I go out to Jim and I start talking to him, and I've used all the tools we just talked about, the non-question question and the rule of threes and all that. Come to find out that Jim comes out of the Army, gets a job as a truck driver, ends up in Detroit, and the truck company went belly up. So he went and got a job at the University of Michigan cleaning medical tools in a surgical unit at the hospital. Noticed that the surgery students had their tools were too big. The scalpels were too big to be operating on mice and stuff like that. So he borrowed their medical books, took them home, read them, went into his garage, and was one of the first people in America to create microsurgery tools.
Wow.
Right. And he had it. If you graduate this spring from the University of Michigan as the outstanding surgery student, you get your name on a plaque with James Crudup's face. And the dean said he was the best professor we ever had, and he had a high school education.
Wow.
And of course, he's in his 80s. So my question to him while we were interviewing him, I said, what do you get out of this? You know, a lot of your students went on to great fame and fortune. And he said, well, I'm 88. And one day I'm going to be in an operating room and I'm going to need help. And I know that I have taught them well.
That's fantastic.
Well, you know, so this isn't feature stories. This is investigative journalism about seemingly ordinary people, which then gives your story so much more depth. And again, you know, I don't want to be pie in the sky here. Look for small victories. You know, today you got the lens cap off. and just keep polishing it, because if it's you'll be able to stand out and people want to come back to your storytelling if certain things rise above the crowd.
What about for those of us who are sent to a crime scene and there's, you know, let's say it was or maybe, I don't know, let's say there was a shooting, police have given very few details. You're with every other reporter from your area, you know, maybe, you know, two people died, you don't know their names, you know, door knocks didn't work out. Like, is there just, can you give, you have such a unique way of thinking, like, how can you make just one of those run and gun stories like that interesting? And how do you catch people's attention? Like, it's, you know, it's often now something happens and you go there and you have to get something on right away. You have very few details, and like, where would you turn? Like, how would you make something interesting?
Well, let me ask you a question. What's the one thing that's lacking from most breaking news stories?
What is the one thing that's lacking?
Mm-hmm. Over and over again. Other than information.
Humanity.
Humanity, right. No, I think the key to it all is context. So, you know, if some house got blown up downtown, on the way, I'm already Googling how many houses in America have been blown up in the last 6 months and why. And, you know, or COVID or gunshots or stuff like that. So that when you do have a chance to ask one question or another, you're able to give them the viewer some information, some context that they wouldn't normally have.
Gotcha. So I don't think we talked about this yet. Another thing you write about is writing to the corners of your picture. Can you explain that?
Okay. If someone is crying, or if a dog is wet, how many times have you seen a story in which you waste time saying, and then the dog shook the water off and went down the street? I call it say dog, see dog. You know, you only have a small time. I mean, I used to, when I first started on the Today Show, they only gave me 59 seconds, not a minute 10, 59 seconds. Everything had to be under 59 seconds. So by writing to the corners of the picture, you fill in what they can't see and they can't hear. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
maybe it's, you know, if there was a tornado that went through a pine forest, you could say on your opening line, you could smell the path of the tornado before you could see it in the early dawn.
Oh, I like
5 miles wide and 100 miles long through a pine forest. So now you're bringing in something that they can't see or hear. That's the corners of the picture, rather than saying it's a terrible tornado. And by the way, this is Jerry's house and it was smashed and Jerry feels bad about it. I mean, I can get that just by your 2 pictures that you've got. So whatever little time you have, fill in the corners of the picture with information they can't see or hear.
So you talk about highlight the universal elements, love and hate, happiness and sadness. Can you explain that?
Well, that's what grabs us into stories. I mean, if you don't touch an emotion, what's the point of your story? If they're not happy about it, the viewer, sad, interested, intrigued, boom, you know. I mean, the folks, the politicians have been turning that on us now for the last 5, 6 years, where everything is, look over here in the corner because I'm going to show you a 3-car accident. I don't mean it that way. I meant the actual universal themes in every movie you ever loved, every book that you ever loved, those universal themes are there, and they are hooked into it by generally highlighting some strong central character who relates to your storyline and is affected by what's going on. And so the audience gets on their shoulder, so to speak, and wants to get through it to see how it's all going to turn out. And that also helps you keep people from clicking away, because stick with me and we're going to find those, whatever this guy's looking for. In other words, you set up a quest a little bit at the front end of your piece, no matter what it is. And then even in a breaking news story where you don't have a whole lot of information, you're laying in some context along the way. Police say that they don't know why they got shot, but 85 people have been shot in the last 2 months, most of which were under 17, in situations like that. So instantly you've already added something more to the story. Than come back to me in 20 minutes and I'll tell you the same stuff I told you 20 minutes ago, because nothing new has happened.
We're going to play a video shortly, but I want to bring up one thing that I thought was interesting in your book. Well, it's what we do, right? You have to be conversational. And
Right.
what I've learned, and I'm sure you can expand upon this, is I will struggle with writing a news story. And then, you start to panic because you're not getting it. And then I've taken a break, and, it'll just to take, a breather, call a friend, and my friend will be like, "What are you doing today?" And I'll explain the story on the phone call perfectly. And then I'm like, "Oh, that's how I have to write it." Right?
Yeah,
But it's
that's
not
right.
always that easy.
Well, it isn't easy, but I had a friend who was an assignment editor in Fort Worth, and he used to say, "My desk is a fence. And before you sit down and write your story, I want you to lean over the fence and explain it to me in people talk."
Oh, I like that.
Right. And so you can do that to yourself as you're driving back or getting ready to say, if I was going to explain this to my best friend or my grandmother or my mother, how would I do it in people talk? And generally, that's the best way to tell it anyway, because you're not so down. I mean, a lot of times we're dealing with a very complex situation. And now we've got to boil it into 4 or 5 things that somebody understands. And that's the reason why you end up trying to figure out, well, how would I say this to somebody uh, who doesn't have a background in this. And the other thing too, which will make it a lot easier for you to write, assume nobody cares. People in our business, because we're hanging out with the sports heroes and the celebrities and the politicians and all that, we know people care, but the only people that really care are the people who are going to be mentioned in your story, right? But if you say to yourself, "I've got this story, nobody cares," then you start saying, what building blocks do I need to make grandma care and the 4-year-old care and the guy that's too busy to tune in care? And that way you become much more efficient at gathering the building blocks, even if there's only 3 or 4, that will make your story stand out.
I love how you say craft your reports in such a way so as not to insult the intelligence of people who know your subject, but at the same time, try to make it fascinating for everyone else. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, I mean, that sums it up. I mean, it's so important. It's not talking down to anyone. It's saying, I mean, it's what we're supposed to do as storytellers, as journalists, is to say, okay, I've done the hard work of listening to all this complex information or a breaking news thing which has no information, but I'm going to be able to tell you the 5 things that stand out in my mind. So for instance, if you go to a flood and the flood's already down out of the house and all you see is rubble, well, maybe if you're shooting a little picture of it, you want to get the apple on the 3rd shelf that has a dust line and put that in the foreground where you show the wide shot of the living room and say, this is Cecilia's home before she left and the water came in. It went up to the top of the apple on the 3rd shelf. See what I mean? It's the details that people catch up. Oh, I get it. I go apples, I know shelves. You're not saying it's 16 feet high, 4 kilometers, none of that. You're saying, yeah.
Yeah, I
So
love that. I know I could talk to you all day, but Brendan, or do you think we can play one of the videos? Hopefully that this will be okay for everyone.
yeah, let me just set it up. This is a story out in the West, and somebody had the great idea of going out and doing ghost towns. So it's exactly what we were just been talking about. I asked myself, well, hell, I know what a ghost town is. And why would we go show another ghost town? Why don't we find a town in an area of a lot of ghost towns and figure out why it is still there? What did the people do in order to save their town? Which then becomes a metaphor and a blueprint to all of us who are trying to figure out how to get through the world. So this is Phillipsburg, Montana.
Today's American Story with Bob Dotson comes from a high mountain valley in Montana where people are surviving on hard times without federal aid or giant corporations. Instead, they have found an antique solution. Bob, good morning.
Good morning. You know, this is one of those moments that you're going to be feeling a little bit like you're homesick for a place you've probably never met. Phillipsburg, Montana is a pioneer town. It's filled with people who have that old spirit that built this country.
Forget for a moment that there are fewer than 2 people per mile in the county, bigger than Rhode Island. Consider what they already have. 2 original live theater productions each year.
Nigel. My Christian name is Nigel.
Hi.
How you doing, girl?
A hospital bankrolled in part by more than $1 million, raised in a thrift store selling hand-me-down clothes.
We need all your money.
Yeah, we need all your money.
Folks in Phillipsburg, the county seat, tax themselves a bundle, $2,500 a piece, to restore their old schoolhouse. Students are learning how to pay that back. This high school shop class is building rooms for the volunteer fire department. Local hunters paid for the project with a sense of urgency. 29 ghost towns surround Phillipsburg.
Deb, why is it that this town exists when other towns have disappeared in the county?
If somebody needs help, everybody jumps in.
Line up! Line up! Line up!
Neighbors saved school superintendent Mike Cutler's life when he was diagnosed with cancer, leukemia, and needed a costly stem cell transplant. Cooks donated meals, raised nearly $40,000 in one day.
The folks who helped, were they all just rich?
Oh, no.
They simply valued the town's survival more than personal gain.
It's tough around here, just like it is anywhere else in this country, but people support each other. You know, it takes a community to keep the community.
A few years later, in the depths of the recession, the neighbors rallied again. The handful of folks in Granite County came up with another $100,000 for Mike Cutler. This time, his daughter needed surgery for brain cancer.
I had to learn how to walk again. I had to learn how to see again. Yeah.
It's way easier being the patient, I know that, than the parent of a little girl or little boy, whoever it may be, that's fighting for their life.
Fortunately, Sidney Cutler lives in a place that nourishes hope.
People that I know, they've helped me so much in helping me overcome my disabilities.
People took care of our animals, took care of our yard.
For months at a time. After each trip to the hospital, Sidney's mom found
there were groceries in the fridge when we would get home.
How can a county with more cows than people come up with $100 grand in the midst of a recession?
They gave from their hearts and they gave from their souls.
More than that.
573.
573.
They donated things others needed to buy anyway. Ranch manager Phil Shields put a cattle chute up for auction. Most folks figured
if there was no town, there'd be no people. So they saved themselves is what they did.
Like they saved the Cutlers. Sidney and Mike are now cancer-free.
All I can say is thank you. And I'm so glad that I knew you. Come on.
Out here, far from the rest of us, America is at its very best.
And this is the last best place, it really is.
Where people can survive, even in hard times, with the help of their neighbors.
Folks in Phillipsburg didn't stop with the Cutlers. They're doing the same for others in need. Ann?
Bob, thanks for showing us what's great and what's the best about America, because when you show us that, you show us what's possible all over America.
You know, out west we think of the rugged individuals, but the truth of the matter is it's the rugged town. That's the amazing part that makes this work.
All right, Bob Dotson, thank you so much.
Awesome.
Let me point out, did you notice in almost every other story, they would set up the town as almost being godlike, that they were different than you and I because they were so selfless. But instead, when they said, or had a soundbite that said that, I said, well, it's got to be more than that. And then they came up with that filling the silence where he said, well, we're selling stuff that people really need, like for instance, that cattle chute. But he would sell the cattle chute for $15,000 when it's probably worth only about $2,000, but somebody needed the cattle chute. So it becomes a blueprint for how we all approach something, rather than just saying, well, be a good Christian or a good Jewish person or a religious person and do what they tell you to do every weekend. We all know that that doesn't always work. So what is it about this town? So in other words, you keep diving deeper because of that rule of threes and it pops up if you don't know them. But I said, well, it's not enough to say be a good person. What else did you do? And that's when they said people will be willing to give a few more dollars for something they need because they know the few more dollars is going to go save Mike Cutler's little girl. And she's, of course, the strong central character. Everybody can relate to her.
And Bob, how long did you get to spend on that story? Were you there for a few, how?
One day.
Wow.
Now, we had been there 10 years prior, so we had a couple other shots to go with it. But that's the thing. And people always say, well, Bob, you have 1,000 hours of stuff. But remember, we have to get on a plane and go someplace and drive half the day to get there. So we became very efficient, all of us working on these things, to say, we'll get this, 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 and this. And of course, obviously, if something popped up in front of you that's tremendous, we'd call an audible at the line. But mostly, I always ask myself, if I had to quit right now, what would be my final shot and what's the point of my story? Now, that could change all day long, especially in a breaking news situation. But by playing that game, you know where you're going. And if you know where you're going, then all you need is the 4 shots to get to the punchline or the point of your story. And it's the same way here. We knew we had a strong character in the little girl. We had the history with what was going on with the father before that, which we'd shot earlier, about 5 or 6 years earlier when we were there the last time. But then we also wanted to spend time showing how exactly that they did it. It wasn't just because they were nice people and they were nicer than you and me because we'd like to do that, but we don't have enough time. No, they did certain things. Like if you want to keep the hospital, then maybe you can sell your secondhand sweater and it's really only worth 25 cents, but somebody will pay you 25 because the other 24.75 will go to the hospital. And now we don't have to go 39 miles to the next hospital up the valley, that kind of thing. So I always see if I can find, even in a short story, a blueprint, a takeaway that goes beyond just what the story is about.
Bob, I do want to get to questions soon, but would you like to play one more video or do you want to take questions and then do it? Because we do try to keep it to an hour if you have a few extra minutes.
Absolutely. Well, let me show one other question, one other piece, the pop stream, because it's exactly what you're talking about. We have, while you watch this, realize that we had one camera and about 3 hours to shoot the entire story.
An 18-year-old from Goose Creek, South Carolina, had a dream that seemed impossibly out of his grasp. But when the Boston Pops came to his home state Tuesday night, it actually came true. NBC's Bob Dotson has that story.
Braden Kirchner likes to conduct music with his eyes closed so he can see his dream. He wants to join John Williams and Arthur Fiedler and Keith Lockhart, the select few who have conducted the Boston Pops.
What do you and Keith Lockhart have in common?
Both young and handsome.
And he's more confident than I am.
Never mind that Braden is just 18. To prepare for a career in conducting, he's learning to play every instrument in the orchestra. 12 so far.
If I gave you orders and I didn't play your instrument, you wouldn't take that order as seriously. No, 1, 2, 3, 1.
Okay.
The friends Braden tutors in Goose Creek, South Carolina know he's serious.
Good, but when you do it, don't go. Just go.
While they hung out last summer, doing what teenagers do, He worked 11 jobs.
I have it planned out. See?
He told his mom, Diane, he needed $10,000 fast.
It was a little shock to me because at that time I just lost my job.
The boy with a dream had seen an ad on the internet saying fans could conduct the Boston Pops if they donated big bucks to the orchestra.
It's just money. And if that can buy you the thing that you wanted all your life, then it's worth it to me.
Braden could have had a fundraiser to get the cash. He did not. Instead, he mowed most of the yards in the neighborhood, worked the overnight shift at the Waffle House, delivered newspapers and pizzas. 6 months later, he had $5,000, half the money he needed.
There were a lot of people talking behind the scenes that when the time came, we would make sure he got there.
Please welcome in his Boston Pops conducting debut, Braden Kirschner.
Turns out that $5,000 was enough. Last night, the Pops performed in South Carolina, just down the road from Goose Creek, with a new guest conductor. Standing on that stage, Braden tallied up what his dream had cost.
All the hundreds of yards I mowed and the hundreds of cars I washed and all the late night jobs.
Is the bill a bargain?
I could buy a new car, but it would rust and break down in 20 years. And then this is something that I'll always have with me.
Oh, he'll have something more than a memory. The Pops returned Braden's money to help him pay for college. Some things aren't bought. They're earned.
My heart jumped out of my chest. It was the coolest thing I've ever experienced.
For today, Bob Dotson, NBC News, Goose Creek, South Carolina.
I wish I could do it again.
What a great story, Bob. Thank you.
I love that. I love the opening with his eyes closed so he can see his dream.
I asked him why he closed his eyes. And he said, so I could see my dream. Now, he didn't say it on camera. Damn it. But that's the thing. If you have something, because you were asking these non-questions and you get like 3 great sound bites, you only have time for one in your very short story. Then you take the second sound bite that affected you emotionally, you paraphrase it, make it your opening line.
I love that. Did you want to talk any more about that before I take questions?
Well, I'll just make one comment, and that is because we only had one camera, we went to the rehearsal that afternoon and we asked Keith Lockhart, what other song are you going to play that has the same tempo? And we went in and shot all the extreme close-ups. Because obviously when he is doing his thing, you're not going to be running around, you're going to be on him, right?
Yeah.
And then we asked the local television station, I said, we'll give you all of our video if you go back at 2 minutes and 13 seconds during the song and shoot the wide shot when the flag comes down. And then we had like a production piece as opposed to, okay, I'm going to shoot a little of this. I got my cell phone and that's pretty much it. And I'm going to do the rest of it on camera.
Cool. All right.
Okay.
So I'm going to start with what I believe is the first question. Lots of print reporters are now doing TV. And that's happening at Newsday where a lot of us here work. Any suggestions about making the transition?
Well, it's storytelling hasn't changed since someone was painting pictures in a cave and went down and watched the dinosaur get hit on the head. It's just that the tools change. And all through my very long career, even working mostly in television changed constantly. I started in black and white film, and look where we are today, right? So all I ask is, what's the game? And because, if you're in print, the most interesting stories are usually visual. Even if you don't have any pictures, the way you write the story comes alive because you're setting a scene for them mentally. Same way with if you're in radio and you don't have pictures, the best radio stuff, you hear the natural sound and suddenly you're there in the flood and all that grabs attention. So all of those are just tools. And of course, it takes some time to get used to using some tools that you didn't do initially. But I stand here to tell you that that's one of the things that will keep you awake for the next 50 years.
And that was from Tom Mayer. We worked together at Newsday. So Adam Skull, is there a difference between voice for TV versus radio? Can we use your style for both?
It's a good question. I mean, back many, many years ago, they had like films that came on in the theater before you watched a motion picture, and it would be like this, the voice of doom and all that. And television started that way. Radio has to be, the pace has to be a lot faster because you don't have the natural sound underpinning and all the other pictures, that help carry it. When you're writing for television, it's almost more like writing poetry. And I don't mean it because it's flowery and you come up with imagery. I'm just saying that's the length. You have to save time for the natural sound and the pictures to play. Whereas in radio, you're creating all the pictures and sound through your description and your voice and maybe a couple of sound bites and maybe some natural sound, but mostly it's your voice has to become theater. And what I mean by theater is not derogatory. I mean that you have to set the scene and make it compelling. But in television, you have so many more tools. You've got pictures, you've got sound, you've got graphics, you've got animation and all that. But some of the most effective television these days is coming from former newspaper people. Look at what the New York Times is doing with their forensic video group, which is, remember January 6th, when the networks were still showing that poor bastard with his head getting, slammed in the door as just kind of cover footage. They're the first ones, as I recall, to put together kind of an outline that said, okay, these people were here. This was the window that they came into. This is what they said to each other. And so again, like I said earlier, you get so much more context. And the viewer craves context because otherwise it's the same thing that flows over them all the time.
The next one is from Jamie Stewart. He's also a colleague of mine. I find myself often falling into the storytelling trap of using the reveal, setting up the story and then giving it the swerve to make it more interesting. Do you ever find yourself having a tough time breaking out of a storytelling habit?
Yes, I think it's sort of like if you've driven to work the same way 4 times, it gets a little boring and you want to see what's going on Maple Avenue, not just on Main Street. So I do a little stutter step, but a lot of times I mean, the story has to go somewhere. It has to have a beginning, middle, and ending, even in a breaking news situation, if you can make it that way. But it doesn't always have to be a reveal. It could be something that builds to that point. I mean, you know where it's going, and yet it's so emotionally stirring because you've held off that part to the end. You don't have to change it and go, here's my reveal. And so that's what I do to kind of stutter step it. So if I've seen it work too long, like how many drone shots have I seen go up over their head and show you stuff? Well, maybe there's a better way to use a drone. They're all just tools. So if I can find a way that is slightly, that actually relates to the story and not just something that I'm just doing because to show people I got a drone, then it's so much more effective because the audience doesn't care about the tools. They care about the moment. And that's what you're trying to create for them.
Kristen Thorne, a friend of mine from ABC here in New York, said, and I think this is great, I find the way my photographer sums up the story to people who come up to the truck asking what we're working on is the best way to write the story. And that goes back to the conversation thing about, or the fence thing.
Right, absolutely. I mean, one of the most difficult things we do is to be able to be simple. And I think that the best way to do that is to write the middle of your story first. And so, that's the easiest part because that's the 2 or 3 points you think you might need to say. And then while you're researching over in your mind, writing the middle of your story, your opening line is going to pop up because you're going to have 2 sound bites, only one you can use, the other one you paraphrase. It already touched you emotionally, so you maybe lead into it. And because even in the car or the truck heading out there, you already know what's going on. You know what your close is, because you've been thinking about it over and over again. And it may have changed a lot, but you know it. So now suddenly you're so much more efficient. And it's like having 4 hangers in a closet. And now you have time to drape the hangers with some details or pictures or information that will make the story compelling and simple and clear. I'll give you one quick example of that. There was an assignment editor, the same guy that asked us to lean over his desk as if it was a fence. I had to go out and do a money piece on the price of beef going up. Does that sound familiar? And he said, well, you could go talk to some guy in a suit in New York City, or you could go down to the stockyards and ask for Benny. tell him to bring out some stew meat. Now, not steaks like you New Yorkers eat, but stew meat like the rest of us eat. And ask him how much it would cost. I mean, how much $5 10 years ago, how much stew meat could you get for that? And of course, it looks like a pizza pie. And then lead him through a couple of years down to the present day. And he says, and every time you say, okay, same $5, how much meat can you buy? And by the time you get down to today, he's going to have an hors d'oeuvre. And he says, you're going to like the butcher because he's a funny guy, kind of like my man, who's trying to find something in a tornado. So the audience is going to be attracted to him, and you're giving them context and information and visually interesting, and you're doing it in about 10 minutes because you're taking the same $5 concept and bringing it down to just this much is how much you have left.
I love that. You touched upon this a little bit, but Tom Mayer is asking how much should you write to the visuals? I mean, you talked a little bit, I think, about you don't always have to, right? And you could kind of save the space for something else, but like, is there a certain extent you should write to the visuals? Like maybe if there's a fire or something.
Oh yes, absolutely. You have to set the scene. And all I'm saying is you don't have to be so say dog, see dog. I mean, if they can see it, you don't need to talk about that. You can talk about how tall the flames were, or how many people you see. You see one fireman is about ready to fall over, and you can talk about how many others that day were overcome by smoke. But that's all I'm saying. Obviously, especially in television, it's so important to write to your pictures. Otherwise, it becomes kind of like a tablecloth. Or like you saw with the January 6th stuff. It was the same thing over and over again. Or 9/11, with the same planes going into the building, and they just use it as cover footage, but it doesn't resonate unless you talk about it and give it some context and write to the corners of it so that you're actually providing some feeling and emotion and information.
And I think just something to add that I've learned along the way when I first became a reporter is that make sure you're on the same page with your videographer, photographer, different terms, same thing, because you might have something in your head that you want to write to, but if you don't tell them, they might not have shot that, right? Have you ever experienced that, Bob? I mean,
all the time. And I constantly keep a dialogue with everybody who might touch this story.
Yeah.
And my key question is, what's the best thing you shot? Or an editor, what's the best thing you found? And one thing that's the easiest to do, and most reporters hate this because you've already got in your mind how you want to do it. But if somebody says, listen, I've got this bird flying and it suddenly gets caught by a hawk and they fall down, I said, okay, I'm going to start with the bird flying and the hawk falling down, because obviously that's a hey, as opposed to I was going to start with everybody walking out into the field and they're looking for something, Okay, but so what you do as a writer, as a storyteller, the easiest thing to change are your words. So if the editor comes up with something, if the sound person over in the corner, if the person who's unloading the truck gives you some insight, then that seems everybody raises their hands and say, oh yeah, that's right, boom. So you just switch and you go with your strongest material and make sure that you don't put in C- video just to cover your A story, your story idea, because you don't have the visual for that, because it's not going to work.
Cool. We have a question from Rebecca Aguilar, who's the president of the society, the SPJ, we call it. Oh, this was your story before. Does he write the story right away as soon as he left Montana?
Well, I'm constantly writing the story, but until they tell me I got to put it on the air.
What was the turnaround for that? I think you might have said, sorry.
Oh, I had only a day.
Yeah.
In that town. Mm-hmm.
So you were writing it immediately after it, basically.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, another question, was that story assigned or was it your own pitch? And I was wondering too, how you find your stories.
Well, the story was pitched was go out and do something on ghost towns. And I said, I don't care about the ghost towns. I care about the town that's still there. So we switched it around. Now, in terms of finding good stories, get away from the crowd. And yourself, if you go someplace at Thanksgiving and you're riding center seat on Delta, the person sitting next to you is going to tell you everything they would never tell their parents, they would never tell their mother or grandparents, because you're listening to them. So I use that. I listen to folks, and then like Scotty Berner, that photojournalist I was telling you about, I bring it around to something that's kind of catches my interest, and suddenly their story goes deeper. And in some cases, you end up with a better story than you went out. Now, hopefully, almost every time you're going to end up with a better story, a better angle, a better approach, a deeper understanding of it, because you've listened to people who are not normally listened to. You know, our business is pretty much set up like a big mirror to reflect power and celebrity. And we do that almost constantly. But behind the media mirror, in the shadows, are people who are coming up with solutions all the time. And if you can find a solution now and then, throw it into your story, and it looks like it was done by the butcher down the street, people are going to come back to you over and over again because they like the way you approach whatever the topic is.
So Sandra Petty said, so you have to be open.
Oh yeah.
And it's along those lines. I work with a great journalist. Her name is Joy Brown, and that was one of the first pieces of advice I got. Was she said, "Be where everyone isn't." I just love that quote. It's the same thing you're saying, but I just guys, I think we're done with the quad. We had Jasmine. She said she's interested in writing about the labor movement work and abolition work. Best of luck to you. Did I get everyone? I would like to, since we have a couple minutes, play that third story.
Yes, and this is an illustration of how you put together a story when you have no pictures, you have a ton of information, you have actually 3 stories going on at the same time, and yet then you're going out to farm country in the winter time on top of that, so you're limited in what you can do. Again, we shot this story in a half a day, and the rest of it was file footage. And even though we were NBC, they wouldn't let me go to Poland, where the key person to the story was situated. So in other words, whatever bad hand you're dealt, I think the success in this business is playing a bad hand well over and over and over again. If you're waiting for the good hand to come, you're not going to be happy. But if you make it a mantra that I'm going to turn this stuff into something, if I only have 5 things, again, like the building blocks, what comes first, what comes second, what comes third? Take a look at it. This is called Life in a Jar.
It's my favorite one.
Today's American Story with Bob Dotson comes from Kansas, where 4 girls in a small town discovered someone very special hiding in history's shadows. She's a woman a world away who saved the lives of 2,500 children and is now on the list for a Nobel Peace Prize.
The keys to history's treasures are often found in unexpected places. This one turned up in a tiny Kansas town, unlocking a story half a world away.
To my dear and beloved girls very close to my heart.
Irina Sendler saved 2,500 children from the Nazi death camps during World War II. She saved her story 60 years for the first child who asked why she risked her life.
My parents have taught me that if someone is drowning, one always needs to give a helping hand and rescue them.
Megan Felt and her friends were putting together a play for their high school history club and found a brief mention of Mrs. Sendler.
It's like it took a hold of us and we couldn't quit. We wanted to know more. We wanted to dig deeper.
So they went to Poland to meet her.
That's a beautiful picture.
And this is the high school play she helped them write.
Isaac, Hannah, this nice lady is going to take you someplace safe.
In 1940, the Nazis walled off a neighborhood near Irina Sendler's home in Warsaw, pressed almost 500,000 people into an area the size of New York Central Park, with not enough food to keep them alive. 5,000 were dying each month. Sendler, a Catholic nurse, bluffed her way inside.
We can walk right past the German officers.
I lost no time on reflecting, knowing that I and my heart had to be there to come to the rescue.
She's only 5 feet tall.
She's less than 5 feet tall, yes. And she's walking out of the ghetto with gunny sacks and driving out hygiene trucks with babies sedated.
The tiny ones she'd put in boxes, and sometimes they would make noise, but she had a dog sitting beside her. What did she do to cover up the cries?
If they got close to the child, she would hit the dog on the paw and it would start to bark and cause chaos, so they had to let her go through. Children, take my hands.
She took the children to Catholic families who agreed to raise them as their own, but wrote their real names on cigarette papers and put them in a jar, which she buried beneath an apple tree across the street from the Nazi barracks.
I know you were not the mother of that child.
One day, Irina Sendler was betrayed, arrested, both her feet and legs broken, almost murdered. But she never revealed where she'd taken the kids. After the war, she quietly dug up the jars and, true to her word, began returning the children to surviving relatives.
One person has the ability to change people.
Mrs. Sendler had a question for you girls. She wondered why you would care when you came from a place that didn't have a Jewish family for miles and miles and miles.
Race, religion, creed, it didn't matter to us. What mattered was good can triumph over evil.
Mrs. Sendler bid them goodbye with a bit of advice. Become like the farmers back here in Kansas, she said. Don't sow seed for food, sow the seeds for good. And try to make that circle of good around you bigger and bigger every day.
This will all end someday.
So the curtain never came down on their little play.
Sign your name, please.
Not even after they graduated, got jobs, got married.
We're trying to repair the world.
Norm Kennard, their high school history teacher, has watched them perform in more than 200 schools.
They're reaching over the walls of bias and prejudice that adults could never attempt to reach over.
Telling the tale of a 97-year-old woman that might have been lost forever had it not been for some small-town kids intent on rescuing the rescuer's story.
I can only follow the need of my heart.
For today, Bob Dotson, NBC News, with an American story in Uniontown, Kansas.
Beautiful story. Up next, a fresh look.
And Bob, that was my favorite. I watched them ahead of time, but that was my favorite of the three. And I mean, just an incredible piece. And what I loved how you did at the beginning is you're comparing the area to Central Park. So those of us who know Central Park, it's like, oh wow, you're just bringing it to life, right? I need to think more like that in my writing.
Well, I mean, that story had so many limitations. We only had home video from when the girls had gone over 6 months before, right? And that was it. So we used it as home video. And then the play that they put on was actually kind of boring, except the parts that we highlighted. So again, it was, where is the point where she may make a line or there's a reaction in the audience? So that made it easier. And then Steven Spielberg was really lovely. He let us have some of that black and white footage to paste the rest of it together. And then other than the half an afternoon we spent in Uniontown, shooting them working at their work and doing the interviews, that was all we had. And yet you had the story of World War II, the story of Mrs. Sendler, the story of those kids, and the fact that they were the only ones. Reporters had asked for years to get an interview with Mrs. Sendler. And one of the things that this is a great point. You don't have time to put it in the story, but you can put it on social media, which I did later. The woman taking care of Mrs. Sendler in the old folks' home, I found out by asking the non-question, was one of the babies she carried out in a satchel.
Oh.
She was now the head nurse in that retirement home. And many of these kids didn't even know that they had parents, because most of their parents died in the ghetto there. And so years later, they finally started comparing notes. They were in their 50s at that point. And they said, oh yeah. And in some cases, if the parents did survive, obviously she dug up the jar and gave them back, but mostly they didn't. But these other parents, there's a second story there that we could do with the parents who took the children in at great risk. And so what did Mrs. Sendler do? Here's the blueprint. She said, I'm going to go to couples that can't have children for whatever reason, some medical reason, they have. And so they want a child so badly that they'll take the risk of taking a Jewish child that I sneak into their home. I mean, so you have all of these complicated stories at all the levels, but it still comes down to a bunch of little girls in a Kansas town in the middle of nowhere were the only people that were able to get Mrs. Sendler to tell her tale. And now, if you want to find out about Mrs. Sendler, they actually have a museum there. And she wrote about 30 different letters to them with a whole story of what it was. And they actually have published a book on it.
Wow, that's incredible. You're getting many accolades in our chat here, Kelly. Kelly, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your last name, but that's Kelly. Let me see what we used to work together in News 12, but Kelly said this has been an incredible opportunity, and she said it's an honor. And David North, a fellow board member, said much good advice and wisdom. So I mean, I think I'm so glad everyone attended. We're so grateful to you, Bob. I try to keep it to an hour. Are there any last minute questions, or are we good, guys?
Well, let me also remind people,
Go
okay,
ahead.
before that last question, let me remind you that if you want to see, there's a 568 of those stories online for free. All you have to do is write in myamericanstories.com, all one word, myamericanstories.com, and they all pop up.
And his book, I highly recommend. I wanted to hold it up, but I have so many bookshelves and I couldn't find it. It's American Story. I said this at the beginning, but American Story: A Lifetime Search for Ordinary People Doing Extraordinary Things. Really cool, and Make It Memorable again has been a Bible to me for news writing. So there was one more question, if you don't mind, Bob.
Sure.
What do you think of the docs on Netflix and elsewhere these days?
Well, I mean, all documentaries have a point of view. And so I get beyond that. I have no problem with how they're done. I think they're the people that have the money. Netflix does, and or at least they did up to this point. So that's one way of being able to get a longer take. The same way with like the visual podcasts that end up getting somebody released from prison, like just this week. I think it's a good place to, if you're interested in doing long form, you could probably develop an idea and get some backing for it.
All right, I think we're good. Thank you so much again. This was great.
Well, it's been my pleasure.
It's such a good, and I'm so glad the videos were able to play. I was getting nervous when it was right at the height of the story and it paused for a second. But thank you again. This was just so enjoyable, and I mean, many of us greatly admire your work. So this was very cool.
Well, I appreciate it, and I hope you have a great path down the journalism trail and have a lot of memories when you get done.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you so much.
Bye, guys.
Bye.